we're very good at explaining what we're against, but not so good at talking about what we're for. And this is why we are struggling with narrative so much. So this is a typical example of some of our messaging around migration, but also human rights in general. So you might see a common trend in all of these messages, basically crime, right? So the key concepts here are human rights and crime, or migration and crime. And what we're often doing, this message comes up in human rights messaging all over the world, because we want to raise awareness that governments are treating journalists like criminals. These human rights groups are being shut down, but they've done nothing wrong. First of all, on a very basic linguistic point, remember what I said about the brain, about different ideas being, they are neurons that fire up when they're activated. And the key thing is that once those ideas, those neurons are fired together, they wire together, they start to fuse. So we're essentially connecting in the minds of our audience the concepts of human rights or migration and crime. Also, what makes this even worse is we're not actually talking about what human rights are. What is migration? Who are refugees? So we never actually get around to our message, because we're so busy refuting the sort of message of the other side, but also in our imagery. So in these images on the bottom, it's Amnesty International have had a colleague jailed. So literally they're putting themselves behind bars, saying, look what Turkey's doing. But what we're essentially doing is, again, we're replicating their image. So if our audience thinks of human rights defenders or refugees and migrants as criminals, or even in some of the rhetoric as animals, putting them behind bars is only reinforcing those associations. What we need to do is, this is the treatment we're against. What is it we want to see? What is the picture we want our audience to have in their mind when they think of human rights defenders or refugees or migrants, or people who are moving? And so if we basically what you're seeing in these pictures is injustice, but what does justice look like? And so this is really important with our storytelling, because we're very stuck with imagery of criminality, but we are creating then inadvertently these associations, actually reinforcing the message of our opponent. If you only learn one thing about narratives from this whole course, it is that if you are using the message of your opponent, if you're repeating the message of your opponent, even to rebut it and prove it wrong with facts, you are reinforcing that message. To me, step one of narrative work, if you don't hire any experts to do audience research, if you don't run a big campaign, for me, what you can do is identify what is it that we want the message to be, and then focus on using that in your press releases, in your speeches, in your research, in your policy document. You don't need to run a wonderful YouTube video campaign. Your starting point is, am I articulating my narrative or the opponent's narrative? And the long-term consequence of just repeating your opponent's narrative is their ideas start to stick in our minds and the minds of our audience. And in fact, we often, internalize some of these messages as well. So for example, research increasingly shows that most people think of human rights as something that's for criminals and terrorists. It is, right? That obviously, a lot of human rights work is about protecting people who are involved with the legal system, but this is not how we want people to think of human rights. And so what we need to identify is, what is the story we want people to think about human rights? And then we all have to repeat it over and over again. This shifting from what we're against to what we're for, sometimes it's hard to do because we're just afraid to ask for it. One of the reasons we actually do just focus on saying they're not a criminal or criticizing, the behavior we're against, is that it's hard for us internally to get everyone agreed on what it is we actually want. But the crucial thing here is to think not just on a policy level, but over the long term, what are the underlying ideas and ways of thinking that we need to make common sense? So George Legoff, who's the sort of main go-to thinker on framing, I really recommend reading this book. On that basic level, his point is, don't think of an elephant. So if you say elephant, people start thinking of an elephant. This is that basic point. Never use the expression, not a criminal. But deeper than that is this point of worldview, this way of thinking. So for example, we often try to borrow the worldview, the way of thinking of, I'll say, opponents in a lazy way, to make the case for what we want. So for example, we'll say refugees contribute to economic growth. So someone will say, oh no, we can't afford refugees, we don't have enough money to look after them, or migrants. And we'll say, well, aha, we've got facts to show you that actually when you take in migrants, it benefits the economy. And this, there's countless times we've had facts in all sorts of elements of the debate to show that it's actually better to do it. But the problem is, when we're doing that, we're accepting the worldview that actually what we should put first is what's good for the economy, that it's about finance and investment. And we're essentially making people who are moving just a resource. It all becomes about investment. So what Lakoff is saying is we need to actually, even though it feels hard, when we make the moral case for what we want, we have to use our own worldview. So he says on the conservative side, it's about fear and individualism. But on the progressive side, it's about empathy, our responsibility to each other, and hope. And so, for example, people should take care of each other. And a lot of the aspects of the progressive worldview or the human rights worldview involve language and vocabulary that feels apolitical. It feels almost naive to use it in a political setting. That's also part of narrative. And so part of the challenge for us is actually, how do we shift those ideas? So this is a little bit like the debate between human rights and security, which is obviously, again, a framing that's a false choice. But the second we say it's not a choice, we don't have a choice between human rights and security, we're triggering security, we're making people think of danger, we're triggering that fear again. Similarly, borders. If we say people before borders, we've mentioned borders and immediately people are thinking of borders, and we're creating the frame for the migration debate that calls to mind this idea of our country is a container and only has so much room, and these other people are going to come into our country, into our container, which will overflow. There's some focus group work that was done to try and start to identify how should we talk about the Europe we want. And interestingly, they also came up with this idea of empathy and community, taking care of each other. That was, which sort of matched with Lakoff, but they found that it's very hard to get away from this idea of borders. So even when they sort of showed Europe the way I'm showing it now, geographically, you still kind of subconsciously see the borders, right? You can probably make out your own country here. So they tried to talk about a Europe of rivers and mountains and forests. But one of the challenges that as soon as we say Europe's built on human rights is all part of European society, we even there are subconsciously reminding our audience that we're European, they're not. And we're reminding people of the otherness of the people we want to help. Right now, we've got a little bit more from, I'm sure you'll have seen that research last week, of what we shouldn't say. What we need to start doing is building up what we should say. Essentially, I talked about mortality salience. So for example, this is some campaigning Amnesty International did. People are drowning at sea and we want to shock people. I'm sure you all share this sort of sense of frustration that, like, how can this be happening? How can people not be more angry about it? So we try and do this. But remember this idea of mortality salience, that if we're asking people to imagine themselves in this situation, we're triggering this and what's called an empathic pain response, which most people don't want to actually, we sort of make up excuses in our mind why that wouldn't be us. So you hear a lot in migration, for example, well, they're breaking the law, they're doing it illegally, right? This sort of fear instinct is not winning the debate for us. So we need to start shifting to, actually, this debate's not actually about the people who move, it's about the people who welcome. And what we need is an attitude and behavioral shift in the people who are not moving, the people who are or are not welcoming. What we want to start doing is shifting, what are we for? But what is the values that we want to see and what is the world we're trying to create? So for example, the story needs to shift a lot more to the people, showing the people whose behavior we want to change and show them people like them acting a certain way to change their behavior. And also showing actually what are the societies we want to create. So you see on the left is basically, in a way, a cliched sort of messaging approach of saying, well, look at fish and chips is something that was brought to Britain by other people, but essentially saying we want diverse societies because diverse societies are more interesting to live in. And underlying a lot of that migration debate is essentially that fear of the other, that fear of difference. A great example of trying to focus our communication on values is the LGBT movement, who built their messaging around this concept of pride. So rather than just saying, look at all this discrimination that's happening, imagine if this was happening to you, they gave people the chance to support their campaign by being part of this sort of all-embracing, open concept that was very hopeful and optimistic, a sense of pride. And so the question for us on both human rights and migration is, how can you be a part of this movement? How can you support it? So not just avoid doing wrong, but how can you actively be part of, these positive values?
So what we're often seeing is that actually companies, television stations,
shoe producers, shoemakers, big brands essentially are quite a bit more effective right now at talking about the values that we're all working for. And we obviously can tend to be cynical at that, but for me the question is, how can we get better at articulating those values as well and bringing them to life?